Hello everyone, today we talk about the Asiatic presence into the Seleucid armies. I decided to choose this topic to begin talking a little bit about Hellenistic warfare, and this is my first video about the Seleucid army. Giving a bit of introduction to the topic, let's say that the Seleucid Empire was essentially the greatest of the so-called successors states that were essentially the ones who were created after during the fragmentation of the Empire of Alexander the Great. And it's a quite overlooked topic in general. You know, this idea of these Eastern kingdoms that eventually at the end of their days were declining and were wiped out by the Romans. It's kind of saying, yeah, maybe they're not that important, but actually between at least the 4th and the 2nd century BC, these guys really ruled the world, and they did that through very amazing military that indeed are very interesting to study. And unfortunately we don't know really much about such armies. Talking about the Seleucids, let's say between the 4th and the 2nd century BC, we don't really know better the end of the 3rd century BC, we don't know that much, simply because if you know, there is no sources talking about it. You really don't know. Much of the sources we have are incomplete because maybe they are epigraphical sources, and the archaeological find went broken. There are parts missing, and we have pretty scanty documentary sources and general stories that really don't tell how it really was from the inside. Like you can read sources like the one of Polybius and getting some interesting details, or maybe even Plutarch. So very sometimes even very late sources in many ways. And this is really a problem that encompasses the whole ancient world. Even the same Roman armies, it's not really that known, especially in Republican times. And that's the reason why I want to dedicate to that at a point. Today I just wanted to start with this topic that seems quite of a niche one, but I think it can't tell much about about the Seleucid army in itself. And I would like to even because there are there's a general there is some spread knowledge about Hellenistic warfare in popular culture in some way, maybe through video gaming and such, but there are a lot of details that kind of get overlooked or simply skipped because popular culture doesn't like to get much into details. I'm not myself an expert about the period, although I can say I've read extensively about that, especially relatively to military history, and I would like to really explain certain things on the base of what we know, at least historiographically speaking. I don't even know ancient Greek practically, so there isn't really much I can do in extreme detail, but the bigger picture can be maybe explained even by me in some useful fashion. So the Seleucid Empire stretched here. I don't have put a map, but substantially take my words, I should be able to explain also this, that is it was a huge empire from in terms of geographical extension. It stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley, so quite of a huge empire. As I was saying at the beginning, was the most powerful among the successors' kingdoms, and it encompassed some of the wealthiest lands of the world at that time, because the Seleucids had their say the core of their domains in Syria and Mesopotamia, being extremely advanced regions, very densely populated, They saw, they had seen millenary traditions and civilizations rising. Think about Babylon. Think about and the Seleucids switched capitals at a point. Initially, they the Seleucids take the name from the founder Seleucus I, and in fact was the city of Seleucia in Mesopotamian, close to Babylon, that was the capital. Eventually was switched to Antioch in Syria, but let's say that Syria and Mesopotamia were the cores. Then there was also Persia, theoretically under the Seleucids. Here, first of all, we have to get rid of any form of precise national border as we conceived them from the 19th century onwards for our own states. This was properly an empire. The name of Seleucid Empire was Arche Seleukeia or Seleukeia. I don't know what's the accent in Greek. And it basically, arche means it's like the suffix arch, so it's something that is someone that stays at the top and rules basically. So it gives a better quite a good picture of what it meant, because for instance the Ptolemaic kingdom was a Basileia, that it's simply a kingdom. The Antigonid Macedon was simply called it was called kingdom as well, but they tended to be called simply Macedonia or Macedonia, because it gave. And the Seleucid Empire said is such a huge thing that it was pretty evident that it was ruled as an empire with a center and a periphery, so that things could even get more complicated in order to administrate it. And it arrived and interacted definitely with the sub-Indian continent. Now, if you look at a satellite map of India, even today, you see that in the north there is basically this huge, uninterrupted green area, like very intense green, and basically in ancient times, having that land in terms of the rivers and this quite fertile soil and the huge amount is kind of endless resources that India had at the time meant really to add a lot of blood to your empire. And there is no surprise that the main goal of Alexander had been eventually to reach India, which was even one of Augustus for the Romans, because really, even though the Westerners really made up to India, Westerners here meant in the narrow sense. Of course, the Scythians, for instance, made it to India and began even to rule there. But even though they didn't make it to conquer India, they definitely had a pretty good picture of what it meant theoretically to subjugate it in terms of resources. And the Seleucids were practically the only successor state that in big fashion basically attempted to reinvade India and to maintain, however, very strong contacts with the Indians themselves. That's the reason why, for instance, the Seleucids had a lot of elephants, because the Indians could literally throw them away. Diplomatically speaking, the Indian sovereigns could simply pay for their treaty conditions into elephants. I will talk about Seleucid elephants in Hellenistic warfare one day. But and the Seleucids also ruled over Anatolia and Palestine at a point. These were kind of more disputed lands, especially on the coasts, especially with the Egyptians. There were a lot of so-called Syro-Palestinian wars between the Seleucids and the Egyptians for the control, as a matter of fact, of Palestine, of Syria, etc. So all these very important, and they and that's part of the reason why, even strategically speaking, probably the capital was of the Seleucids was shifted to Antioch at a point because it was closer to, was a pretty good position in itself, which explains also the development of the city as such. But it probably was a better choice. Even though this basically implied that the eastern frontiers were left a bit more unguarded, and the Seleucids faced quite important rebellions in the east. The most important one probably being the one of the satrapy of Bactria. The Seleucids, in their administrative repartitions, maintained the old Persian Achaemenid repartitions. So Bactria basically rose, the local Greeks that existed even previously in their to the Alexander conquest rose together with the Seleucid satrap appointed there and founded a kingdom on their own in today's roughly Afghanistan. So there were also a lot of major wars to bring back even Persia and other lands of the east under the control of the Seleucid dynasty. What is interesting in this picture is that the Seleucids were really busy keeping all things together. This, in my opinion, probably triggered a better organization. More resources put into the organization of the empire, and especially in the organization of the armed forces, because basically the empire was held by, not even materially by the military expeditions, but just by the deterrent that a professional army could represent, even when it was not in service. And this is how empires were held together at one point. So the Seleucid military stands out also in here among the other successor states militaries for its power. Essentially, the Seleucids fielded the major armies of the times, and they retained their typical Hellenistic warfare for how the Macedonians had created it. So the famous phalanx, the Hellenistic phalanx, so the one with the long pikes, made up by several tens of thousands of men, and which was an extremely costly military tool. Like I won't be discussing it today, but I definitely have to dedicate a video to the ridiculously high costs that the phalanx implied. I mean, you can't even understand if you have never read about it, how much a single pike, a single sarissa or sarissa could cost to produce, to be worked. Fielding such numbers was a huge enterprise, and that tells you also the might of the Seleucids in many ways, because they had these big rich lands and they could put that together. But the smaller Hellenistic militaries, like the ones of the Attalids, for instance in Pergamon, and who didn't have enough land, enough people, enough wealth to raise an army. In fact, seemingly they didn't have a phalanx on their own. Like the Attalids are not seemingly there is no historical evidence that they made a use of a phalanx, because at a point on a smaller scale it was more convenient in proportion to use just other kind of troops. And Hellenistic warfare was at the time of at the peak of the versatility and adaptability that you could find at all times. So simply also because the lands over which the successor states stretched really had a lot of rather warlike peoples that could be brought under arms. and raised even as as mercenaries or allies or subject levies. And this is what I really want to talk about today, relatively to the Seleucids, for one apparent reason. The Seleucids made next to the phalanx an extensive use of Asiatic irregulars. When we say irregulars, we have to mean, sometimes even quite prized troops from tribals, militaries that could be extremely, professional in their own way. But there is a major hole in this picture that we would like to explain. That is that the peoples of the heart of the Seleucid Empire, so as we said, Syria and Mesopotamia, do not seem to have been to participate to the military. I mean, first of all, to be armed, but these are two different things, and I'll be explaining here, because it was pretty much obvious that the lands that Alexander conquered were already quite developed in terms of civilization to his own. I mean, the idea that the Achaemenid Empire was not at all a barbaric or despotic, oppressive and backward system like the Greeks tried to paint it, because they were extremely proud of their own freedom that they used to kill each other, by the way, quite eagerly. But on the contrary, was some of the most advanced empires of the world at the time, and Alexander was definitely a genius in his own mind, and he had a great vision that I believe no one in history was able to achieve. In many ways, obviously understood that in order to make his empire survive, he failed into this, but he got right at least the essentials conceptually that were inherited by the successors in many ways, was to integrate and to imitate the local, to emulate in many ways, replicate, many words we can use to define that, the local administrative systems. If anything, because they were extremely advanced. I mean, think about bureaucracy. Bureaucracy had been born there. It's from the first Mesopotamic civilization that you find, the first archives of the first bibliotheques, the first palaces, and so on. And these were peoples in turn, societies in turn, that were kind of used to have a single leader for a freaking lot of people, differently from the Westerners that at this time, like the Greeks and the Macedonians, that even if they had been able to imitate the urban and political models, obviously adapted in their own way, of the Mesopotamic and Egyptian civilizations, they really didn't like one chief at the top, and were kind of divided on the base of the ancient idea that the Indo-European tribesmen, in which among whom everyone was free, technically speaking, even though it's still an ideal picture of the world. And these were all this for saying that the civilizations that the successor states controlled were quite good in terms of public order, because there were already the tools to keep them subjugated, and it's not a good idea at that point to arm them. If anything, for one numerical macroscopic evidence, because the Macedons, the Greeks that actually went into the East, were a very strict demographic minority. We have evidence, at least of not more than 16,000 Westerners settling from Europe into these Asian lands, And you have to think that regions, especially like Mesopotamia or Egypt, were populated by millions already at that time. So it was pretty much evident that arming these guys, the local populations, for militias and kind of paramilitary duty would have been pretty risky and useless in many ways. Also because probably the way the successors ruled was already enough, was already enough to keep them content. This, however, doesn't mean that there weren't rebellions or that they couldn't find weapons anywhere. But let's say that the more you find the stronger a state is, and the more it has the possibility of disarming the subjects in this case, if not the citizens, in more recent times. And this can be one reason, but I think the difference is a bit, a bit more complicated. First of all, in later history of the Seleucid Empire, we find certain city militias, especially in Syria, but we are, here it's kind of an exception that confirms the rule in many ways, because it would be obvious that cities had some form of militia. We can assume that especially wealthy cities like Babylon or I don't know, that they had already social classes that were rich enough, like aristocracy, that could arm themselves, and that would be, however, already integrated into the political power. And this is the key point here, because if you read the sources of this age, you might say, well, here Syrians and Mesopotamians never appear as names among the all the various contingents that instead you can find from other peoples all around the empire that were raised. But this is not really an evidence that Syrians and Mesopotamians didn't participate to the Seleucid army. On the contrary, I think that you don't find those names exactly because they were raised into the Seleucid army. Now, this is a topic of great, debate in historiographical terms, and we know such a very few things, so we can't be sure about it. But there are studies that show. Well, first of all, I should explain this. That so where did the Seleucids take their phalanx from? Because that's the real point. The phalanx, as we've seen, could count up to like 20,000, even more phalangites. And who were these guys? Well, these guys, according to the old historiography that took the terms to the letter, were made up by the so-called Macedonians. Who were these? Theoretically, these would be the descendants of the old Macedonians, the old Macedonian soldiers that had made up Alexander's army, and then as veterans would serve under the various successors like Seleucus and basically settle definitely into these lands. So initially there is no doubt that these armies would be made up by Macedonians or even Greeks, because there would be at that point even a pretty, the Macedonian army at the time of Alexander was pretty much, whoever could join, you could make that. It was very open. It was like in Roman times with the Marian reform, that it didn't matter who you were as long as you could take arms. And in the Marian reform you had to be a Roman citizen. But that was, surpassed by, especially quite simply extending the citizenship. In Macedonian terms, these were pretty random soldiers that were something quite new in terms of professionalism, because Greece hadn't had that essentially. The mercenaries were kind of spreading. The Greeks were taking mercenaries, especially from other peoples, but it was still the idea of the peasant citizen soldier. Instead, the Macedonians started to say, okay, now we have money, because they had just conquered Thrace and made a lot of money with the silver mines that they found there. So we have coins to pay you with, and whoever you are, join. And there is no pretty much no great requirement. We can imagine these guys would be mostly Macedonians. So let's say that the first generation of soldiers that fought under Alexander and then as veterans under the successor states were definitely Macedonians, Greeks, Westerners, however you want to call them. Eventually they got settled, and here there is it's very complicated to explain in synthesis, but basically there is a lot of debate whether how the Macedonian veterans were eventually settled into the successor empires. Certain people believed that there were strictly military colonies made up of guys who basically lived as I can say isolated, but a sort of one body community of soldiers that kind of perpetuated itself over the generations, carrying out that duty. Other authors, other historians suggest instead that the settlements, which have even pretty generic terms in the way they are called, would be normal settlements like other cities that existed along the empire, and that like even foreign cities, obviously, into which these soldiers would dwell, eventually intermarrying with the local population and such. The most equilibrated perception is that there was actually a sort of class of caste of Macedonian military men that could pass from father to son the office of fighting, especially initially. Afterwards, these communities of Macedonians, they're kept being called over time as Macedonians, and this is why the perception is a bit it's a bit tricky. Basically kept, these Macedonians intermarried with local women, but especially it seems that external people began to join these communities as soldiers and becoming, when I say legally, when I say politically, Macedonians as such. And this seems to be the most advanced suggestion that we can find. That is, essentially, these guys are called Macedonians. They are they have a special status. They have to provide to their own equipment with land that is being rented to them. They have to keep on in training, but essentially they can include also other peoples coming from other types from other lands, especially from the local lands. So the absence of ethnonyms like Syrians, Mesopotamians, and even Persian, telling the truth, especially in the south area of Persia, the one of Persepolis that had been colonized by the Seleucids and that was most strongly under their control, never appear because these guys would join the so-called Macedonians and figure as Macedonians in the sources. And this was a matter of prestige, you have to understand, where these communities would even have probably a very strong esprit de corps. They would have a cultic practices. The idea of this veteran identity of the unit of the corps is something that you find still today, and at that time seemingly around these communities would really happen in this fashion. So we can argue that over time, especially towards the end of the Seleucid Empire, the so-called Macedonian phalanx was actually made up by Syrians, Mesopotamians, even Persians, and other ethnic elements that would come individually to join these communities. So the explanation, well, the Seleucids didn't arm those guys, and they excluded them from their army because they didn't want to have revolts in the near to the centers of power, is kind of an excess in this sense, because probably at that point the Seleucids could have not prevented even rebellions if they had not co-opted certain aristocratic or even popular elements into their army. But they were effective in doing this. There is a lot of debate, for instance, relatively to what was happening in parallel with Ptolemaic Egypt. And also in here there is a sort of myth for which the so-called Machimoi, that were the Egyptian native infantry, was at a certain point integrated by the Ptolemies into their phalanx, and this would cause rebellions because basically these Egyptians wanted to obtain higher status as from subjects that they were at that point under the Ptolemies, etc. But also here there are exactly the same problems in terms of sources. We can't really identify who was Egyptian, who was Macedonian in Egypt, what were numbers, the balance, and whether the things went wrong, because the Ptolemaic kingdom kind of had, telling the truth, well, it wasn't that worse compared to the Seleucids, but it was, at least from a military point of view, probably the Hellenistic, the successor state that abandoned the earliest, the old Macedonian phalanx, at least in terms of organizations, and organized the army more according to an Hellenistic light infantry, and even certain so-called Romanized troops, although it seems that even the Seleucids did something like that. But let's say that the Seleucids, compared to the Egyptians at this point, to the Ptolemies, seem to have maintained for a longer time a more efficient military system of recruitment that worked not just to provide a very effective military power to the empire that achieved great things during especially the end of the 3rd century, so after a time which normally the states the successor states would have run out of steam, but also to successfully integrate the local populations of Syria and Mesopotamia into their military systems by maintaining very strongly through military administration the idea that there would be certain particular communities scattered of so-called Macedonians scattered all over the empire that had to provide the military, the bulk of the army at that point. And this administrative military administration is actually was very complex as far as we know. For instance, especially the detachment of all these communities is remarkable. For instance, the royal stables were famously at Apamea in Syria, or in North Mesopotamia, I don't remember that, because there is an Apamea also in the south of the Caspian Sea, close to Hyrcania, or in Atropatene, I don't remember. As far as we can understand, the Seleucids managed to keep, at least between Syria and Mesopotamia, a very broad net of military administration that worked based on these local colonies, we want to call them, that were capable of integrating the new elements, new manpower, and catalyzing the process of integration with the local populations. And I would say that this is really the best recipe for making an empire going well. I mean, it's similar to what the Romans practically did. They integrated foreigners in their own army, and that's how they managed to grow so much. Here, the Seleucid system was a bit different in the sense that the Hellenistic world was, a bit more opened than the Hellenic one towards strangers, even if this is debatable in many ways. But it's still remarkable that the Seleucid Empire remained for such a long time, relatively long time, capable of fielding such extraordinary armies without seeing a substantial decline like it happened in Egypt at some point. Then also the Seleucid Empire and Egypt underwent a series of civil wars, etc., especially in the Seleucid Empire from the time of Antiochus the Fourth. But otherwise, these were kind of dynastic problems and rebellions. Otherwise, it seems that the system might have hold, and the Romans fought and thanks to against the Seleucids, and thanks to this we know through Polybius, especially some news about the Seleucid army, how it was organized. We can add details to the informations we have, but overall the broad picture is still quite foggy. We don't quite reasonably we can't really reasonably focus what the situation was really like in terms of administration. What is evident is just the sheer numbers of phalanxes of phalangid soldiers that the Seleucids could field, and also their effectiveness to say that what they could that behind this there was something really big, great, and that functioned, and that about which unfortunately we don't know much. So this is just for dispelling the myths relatively to the fact that there is the old interpretation is that the Seleucids had a better army because they disarmed the local population, while the Egyptians had trouble with the Makimoi, native Egyptian infantry, and their phalanx declined earlier. No, there is no evidence of both things. So if you ever hear or find this or find it written, don't really believe it, because there is no historical evidence of this, and this is a broad generalization that doesn't even seem to be true at all. So also because you have to think that such easy and simplistic answers are kind of driven by ideas like which are typically modern, by the way, in prejudice and stereotype, like those guys were stupid because they did wrong, and those guys were intelligent because they did good. No, especially when you talk about such big statal entities that were quite rare at that time, you can be sure that things could go wrong, but if they went wrong because there were pretty macroscopical structural problems that probably those who lived in those times had complete understanding with, and they tried to solve at their best. Never think to be more intelligent about that world than the people who actually lived in it, because this is what we tend to do too much as moderns towards those who preceded us. And I would say I would like to add another point about this that maybe can clarify or give a better dimension of the thing, that is relatively to the Persians and their because the Seleucids, because Persia wasn't practically the core of the Seleucid Empire, yet it was a place that... so actually Persia has always been a tough ground to control. Tough because, first of all, look at the terrain, it's not that great. And then especially because Persia had quite of common identity, like Mesopotamia and Syria, so they could, the local aristocracies could make body to kind of to the external invaders. Even if you look into later history of Persia, for instance, during the Islamization, you understand that it's the Arabs got much more Persianized than what the Persians got Arabized, or yeah, I don't know how to say it, Islamicized or something like that, because it was a great pool of power. And as I was saying before, the area that the Seleucids managed to control the best was in the south, on the Indian Ocean, along the coast, and with Persepolis, that should be, if I'm not wrong, right, a bit more inland, and was also the easiest land to pass through, because the center of Persian states has a lot of mountains. It's even cold, very cold, so that would be of easier reach for the Seleucids, from especially from Mesopotamia. And it's not surprising at this point that seemingly those lands could very likely provide recruits for the phalanx at that point, and that we don't find a special Persian definition for allies of our troops that were drawn from Persia, while the only kind of Iranian, even though this is meant the broad way, like the ethnic way, not Persian, irregulars that we find in the Seleucid armies were the one of the Dahai, who lived in if I'm not wrong at this time, in Hyrcania, that is the region between that flat land essentially between the Caspian Sea and the Iranian plateau. That is basically last stripe of steppe area stretching towards the north. And these Dahai were kind of were not Persian. In fact, they were quite close to Persia. They would also be quite close to the Parthians, who came from the Caspian Sea and eventually created their own Arsacid kingdom into Persia. But these were completely different. They were a free tribe. So first of all, they were nomads, at least, or semi-nomadic, whatever you want to call them. We know that the Seleucids fielded these troops at Magnesia, for instance, against the Romans, in an army of 1200, and then also in other battles. But it's interesting in here because instead this tribe is mentioned as effectively allied troops, and this means that probably all the peoples that were being counted by the sources as non-Macedonians in the Seleucid armies were kind of allied troops of peoples that were also a bit detached from the core lands of the empire. So the Dai would be simply guys who said, okay, let's go fight for these guys, we will pay us and then come back home, but they weren't really subjects, and like they could be the one of Persia. So there would be nothing strange at this point, also as another hint, at least to consider it so, in thinking that you don't find the ethnonym Persian into other into the Seleucid armies otherwise, although we have certain knowledge of single individuals or maybe just of one in all Seleucid sources, but I'm not sure about this. I could be wrong. That means it was a Persian joining a group of another of those military colonial communities that, however, were not Macedonians, but if I'm not wrong, they were Mesans or stuff like that. Yeah, and also another point relatively to this, now that I thought about it, is that we have evidence in the Seleucid army that the Seleucids made much more extensive use of Western allied peoples or mercenaries than Eastern. The reason could be actually that the Eastern world, as we've seen with the Dahai, was much more out of reach, while but especially that the political powers that existed in northeast of the empire were kind of freer, kind of more structured, kind of more autonomous, and more difficultly they could be brought with much more difficulty under the Seleucid actual control. While all those small peoples that that existed, for instance, in Anatolia, like the Cilicians or the Mysians, etc., were kind of more framed between other big powers, and were kind of more used to, first of all, have less contractual power from a political and military point of view, and that therefore could be more easily hired as mercenaries and used as such. And probably were also cheaper. This is the idea I get, because the eastern you get, the more you have cavalry, for instance, and cavalry costs a lot, even if it's effective, while the guys in especially in southern Anatolia that the Seleucids used were kind of light infantry that were still quite effective, however, in certain kind of warfare, protecting the flanks of the phalanx, or making skirmishes in the front line, etc. So this might be a reason, but it's still speculative also in many ways. However, you can be certain one thing is that the Seleucids, in spite of the very wide ethnical variety of irregulars that they employed in their armies, actually never made it to successfully integrate the Eastern cavalry into their ranks. Although, and this for saying that the Eastern horse-riding peoples were kind of always out of their reach in terms of submission. I mean, they could be subjugated, but just in terms of, you want me, attack me again, as they used to do in their raiding strategies, but they weren't controllable, especially with all the problems that the Seleucids already faced with the other sedentary peoples like the Egyptians, etc. So the eastern frontier was paradoxically a bit less turbulent for the Seleucids, in spite of the greater strengths of the tribes that inhabited there. And however, the Seleucids also made it think about the Anabasis of Antiochus III, which means the expedition into the hinterland, let's say, to bring back even part of the eastern lands under the control of the empire. However, there is an evidence, and this is still worth the mention, and we'll discuss this in another video, of sort of replica of Eastern heavy cavalry by the Seleucids, which seemingly saw the participation of Medians, the Media being a region basically between Mesopotamia and Persia. That in the key into which we have read the relation between the Seleucids and the local population might have been made up also by a significant native intervention, like even though this is also debatable in many ways. The famous cataphracts, the heavily armored and the full armored cavalry that the Seleucids at a certain point used, especially having coming back from the Anabasis in the east, suggests that it was probably sort of Eastern influence indeed into those armies. But enough for today. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel to receive further news about my videos. And for now, I thank you heartily for for listening to me, and I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye!